Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. This week we've got to cover the developments in Syria, the unfolding of the world and European financial crisis. We've got to talk about the healthcare decision at the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll try to find time to say a few things about Marx. I see people are interested in Marx and Marxism. We should say a few things about the U.S. Constitution to dispel some obscurantist propaganda, and we may even get a chance to look back to the War of 1812, 200 years ago. Boy, if you want to see evidence that Thomas Jefferson was one of the worst presidents, right? Thomas Jefferson almost lost this country. The country was almost destroyed under Jefferson and Madison and their crackpot views. That almost ended everything back in the War of 1812. So we've got to talk about all of that. Remember that you want to keep up with everything at tarpley.net. There are always new postings at tarpley.net. And there you find my books. People have been sending me emails. They support my work. Please, if you do, make it concrete. Buy my books, read them, discuss them, popularize them, introduce them on internet sites, on talk radio, or anywhere else. But those books, and if you want to talk to me about issues, please read the relevant book, because I, unfortunately, will not have time to reproduce those arguments individually for people in emails. If you want to talk about 9/11, well, read 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA in the 5th edition, and you'll know exactly what I think about it. That is more authoritative than any conference presentations, especially conference presentations under the somewhat difficult conditions of this last conference in Vancouver, British Columbia. But let's look at Syria first of all. On the surface, we are edging towards a regional war in the Middle East. This is not irrevocable. Some of this is war. Some of this is propaganda. But on the other hand, in the past week, we've had Turkey, first of all, sending a reconnaissance-configured F-4 Phantom jet into the airspace of Syria. They did this as a provocation. They were testing. The plane flew in and out of Syrian airspace, back in, back out, back in, back out, and eventually, conflicting reports, anti-aircraft artillery or a surface-to-air missile took care of this Phantom. One of the aspects of this that we should note is it shows Syria is not a cakewalk. Syria is not defenseless. Syria has air defenses. They are capable. They are alerted. They were not taken by surprise. They saw it coming. So there's the idea that if somebody wants to go blundering into Syria with aggression on the Libyan model, they will pay a heavy price. Good that they know it in advance, because this is by and large, the only thing that stops Anglo-Americans from going on their rampages of aggression. So right now, we've had a meeting of NATO about this. NATO, what are we talking? Chapter 5, I guess. The collective defense of the North Atlantic Treaty. Well, let me say, the willingness of the American people to fight a war in the defense of this border of Syria and Turkey and Syria is zero. And any president that does this will be joining LBJ in the historical doghouse of presidents that have destroyed themselves with lunatic foreign adventures. Now, the question with Turkey is obviously that of the leadership. Erdogan, how far is he prepared to go? Erdogan just had an election. He fell short of the 60%, I guess, he needed to have a unilateral control of the Constitution. He doesn't have a constitutional plebiscitary majority. He's only got 50.1% or something like that. So He may be resentful of that. He may feel that he needs to escalate foreign tensions in order to consolidate some power. But the question is, in crude terms, how crazy is Erdogan? How crazy is he? Has this dream of the neo-Ottoman Empire that he thinks he's going to be the protagonist of, has this gone to his head so that he has lost all moorings in reality? Because that is what it will be, but that's the dream, but that will not be the reality. The reality is Ataturk was right. Turkey cannot survive as an imperial power. On the other hand, Turkey can be tremendously successful following the Ataturk model within the borders of Turkey. So don't try to reconquer elements of the Ottoman Empire, such as Syria, but rather concentrate on development and solving your problems at home. Will Erdogan do that? The other thing about Erdogan is he thinks he's cutting the figure of the new Ottoman hegemon of the Middle East. Look at who he's working for. He's the running dog of the Saudi royal family. He's the running dog of Qatar. He's the running dog of those United Arab Emirates, the most reactionary, the most feudal, the most oppressive, the most benighted people in that part of the world are essentially paying the bill for Erdogan. He's working for them. And if we go back to World War I, Erdogan, in the dream of neo-Ottomanism, is putting Turkey under the control of these upstarts who rebelled, right? Who was the Saudi royal family? They were just a bunch of nomads picked up by the British and put on the throne. And the same thing goes for these Emirates, right? Kuwait, created by the British, right? Carved out of the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. So this is not a path of glory for Turkey, and we seem to have some awareness of this in the Turkish political process. We have the Republican Party. There's a guy called Kılıçdaroğlu. They are saying we need to stop the needless provocations of Syria. There is going to be a backlash within the country because many Turks are just too intelligent to go down this road. But I think Erdogan and Davutoglu have kind of lost it when it comes to reality. And of course, on the one side, they make Turkey into a terror base. Right? Rick Perry was right. It was an amazing moment. But Rick Perry was right to say Turkey is a base for Al-Qaeda. It is. Go to Iskandarun. You'll find Al-Qaeda in the next room in the hotel. Tourism to Turkey, not a good bet at this time. So they've got the Al-Qaeda moving in. You've done that. Well, then you've got safe havens on the Turkish side of the border. In theory, under international law, Syria would be justified in exercising hot pursuit of terrorists as they retreat back into Turkey after attacking on the Syrian side. Hot pursuit is an established category of international law. So you could violate the Turkish border if you wanted to and say this is hot pursuit because they sent a death squad over here. They blew up some tanks. Now they're retreating. We're going to chase them back in. That's called hot pursuit. This is an interesting doctrine. But generally speaking, the dangerous thing is that in Erdogan's speech, he says, any Syrian forces approaching the Turkish border will be shot at. Wait a minute, approaching? So I'm the Syrian army. I can drive my tank up to a mile from the border, up to half a mile. What's approaching? What does this mean? Are we getting into the logic of a buffer zone and a humanitarian corridor, a juridical vacuum where the Syrian government won't exist, but the death squads would have a base? Back in a minute.
Are you tired of searching for great talk radio?
Something more important.
Search no more. We are the GCN Radio Network.
Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Here is my advice to Erdogan and Davutoglu of Turkey. Vaziyeti kurtaran bahane. Vaziyeti kurtaran bahane. This is Turkish. Find a face-saving excuse. Find a way out of this thing. Don't get into a contest, a provocation contest with Syria so that you eventually get goaded into war. Because here's the funny thing. The Saudis are paying, right? Qatar is paying, but I really doubt that when war comes, if it comes, Saudis and Qatar are not going to be doing much fighting. They're probably going to be doing none, although we have to look into that. And poor Erdogan will find himself all alone, and he will not have a happy experience in this. So it's time to find a way to pull back. This Turkish plane was, I believe, testing the air defenses. We used to have this in the Cold War, right? NATO would take a jet, and it would start, from Ramstein or something like this, and it would go right at the German border, right up to the DDR border where the communist East began, and they'd take it as close as they could to the border. It would turn away at the last instant, and the idea is they'd want to see the radars lighting up, the missiles beginning to position themselves and so forth. And it seems to me that's what this was done. The Syrians might also have thought that they were dealing with a cruise missile. That is possible. Coming in at fairly high speed at low altitude, that could have been a cruise missile. But the response was quick and decisive. So, again, I am a well-wisher of Turkey. In the late 1980s, I met with Prime Minister Özal, the Foreign Minister Halefolyu, the Defense Minister Yavuz Türk, the Public Works Minister Giray, who at that time was building the Ataturk Dam. He was the biggest construction entrepreneur in the world at that moment with the Ataturk Dam, a tremendous achievement. The mayor of Istanbul, Darlan, who was solving some of the problems of the sewer system of this ancient city. Great well-wisher of Turkey, and that's why I'm saying it's time to pull back from this stuff, because as General Michel Aoun told me in Beirut last November, he's a wonderful guy, the de Gaulle of his country, the de Gaulle of Lebanon, a nation builder in a region that needs people like this. He said, look, Turkey is the most fragile country because it's got half Islamists, half strong secularists who don't want Islamism. The army is going to be secularist, and you've got this 25 to 30% Kurdish minority. So if the Turkish government insists on providing bases for death squads and Al-Qaeda along the Syrian border, well, don't be surprised if Syria is providing bases for the PKK and other forces, and I'm just speculating. I don't know this, nothing I saw, but you can figure, just the way of the world, sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander, right? Reciprocity, the great principle of international affairs. What you do to them, they will do to you, or at least they'll try. And in this case, it would be the general uprising of the Kurds, which I think Turkish governments would have every reason to fear, and I think it wouldn't be good for the region. The Turkish Kurdish uprising would lead to a civil war in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, 4 countries carved. Who wins? U.S. and the British win. That's their policy. Mini-states, micro-states. So this kind of a war makes no sense. So I appeal to the inherent good sense of the Turkish people, the Ataturk tradition, which is admired in Egypt, right? The average Egyptian wants a Turkish-style government. They would love an Ataturk coming in or an Ataturk-style government, at least in Egypt. So right now, today, we have Hillary Clinton meeting with Lavrov in St. Petersburg, and the issue is the transition. Well, Lavrov has said, we don't discuss transitions. That's up to Syria. We don't impose any model on on Syria. So I don't think that's going to go anywhere. The NATO side wants to have a list of people who are banned from being in the government with Bashar Assad at the top of the list. This will not go down. And then tomorrow, the first day of this program, right, and let's also specify when, tomorrow meaning the 30th of June, we're taping here on the afternoon of Friday, June 29th. On the 30th of June, we're going to have a Geneva conference of sorts about Syria. As far as I can see, Syria is not going to be there, which that's not what we want. U.S., Britain, France, Russia, China, Turkey, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar. They will be there. Iran will not be there. This makes no sense. Iran is an important regional power. This is the lunacy, right? The ideological diplomatic obsession of the U.S. that they don't want Iran there. And then apparently to balance that, the Saudis are not there. How can you not have the Saudis? They've got to be sitting there. They've got to be confronted. You are paying for Al-Qaeda in Turkey. You Saudis, cease and desist. That's got to be said. So what we do not want is a new Munich. No new Munich 1938 at the expense of Syria. And what we've had, of course, as we've detailed over the months, we have seen the application by NATO of the Nazi methods of 1938 vis-a-vis Czechoslovakia, right? The Henlein and the fomenting of an ethnic rebellion, right? The Sudeten Germans. We've seen the mission of Lord Runciman, now carried out by Kofi Annan, to deliver the place into the hands of the imperialists, we would say today. And then we've even seen, after the application of Nazi methods, Czechoslovakia in 1938, we're now seeing Nazi methods, Poland, 1939, the Gleiwitz massacre with bodies being used as props, right? Dead and to some degree decomposed bodies being spread around for photo opportunities by the NATO death squad butchers that this Hillary Clinton and Fabius and Kofi Annan want to put into power. This is absolutely impossible. So the bottom line is there must be no new Munich at the expense of Syria, and Turkey would be well advised to find a way to simply cool this entire situation. So there's been a lot happening on the Syrian front. Too much bluster, not enough statesmanship. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.
The GCN Radio Network, providing the world with hard-hitting talk radio. GCN. Great talk radio starts here.
Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Follow everything at Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. And if you like what you hear, buy and read my books, Pick Your Topic, Economics, International Terrorism, Bush. We're going to have the 20th anniversary month of George W. Bush, the Unauthorized Biography, the book that for the first time revealed Prescott Bush financed Hitler, provided weapons for Hitler's seizure of power. Everything after that is copied from this. People of great reputation. Along comes Kevin Phillips. Along comes various other people, essentially lifting this. Some with attribution, some without. Some with attribution and insults. Loftus gets it from there. Doesn't acknowledge where he got it. There you go. So that's fine, but it's the 20th anniversary of a book that has become an internet legend, and you want to have a paper copy of that book. Another, all sorts of interesting things in there. We just had the anniversary of Watergate. The thing that one of the main episodes in Watergate is the smoking gun tape. The smoking gun tape is not the one that was erased. It's the one that talked about the Texans, the Texans, the Texans. Who were the Texans? George H.W. Bush was the one that Nixon was talking about. That was the stuff with the money and the perjury and everything else, and the Zapata Petroleum and all of those people, and Chairman Mao Liedtke, Bush's business partner, all interesting things. We'll be talking that up during the month of July because that will mark the 20th anniversary of that book coming out. So don't believe the activists say school of journalism. In the Bush book, I talk about the Red Studebaker School of Journalism. Anytime you found a Red Studebaker at the beginning of Bush's career, you knew you were dealing with a controlled biography. As soon as you hear activists say, you're dealing with NATO propaganda. And we just had, to back up what I was saying about Kurdistan, Kurdish rebels have killed 8 Turkish troops in the Hakkari province of southeast Turkey in the last week. So Turks, this is going to be it. You can't, you got to expect retaliation. If you pick war, right? If you don't want war, then don't engage in it. War is going to be a two-way street. So there's also a good case you could make that Hillary, Panetta, and Petraeus can all be impeached for providing material support for terrorism. That is to say, the Al-Qaeda people operating out of the south of Turkey. Now, let's move on to European and related finance. Well, not even Europe, although it is Europe. The London whale. The London whale turns out to be bigger than anybody thought, right? This is Moby Dick to the fourth power. J.P. Morgan Chase has now been forced to admit that the losses on their London whale, which means a bet on synthetic credit derivatives, that is to say, not credit default swaps, but an index based on credit default swaps, a second-degree synthetic derivative, $9 billion. And the sky's the limit, because with these wonderful inventions, these wonderful financial engineering devices called derivatives, there is no limit to the losses. That's why you can have a country like Cyprus blowing up and requiring billions and billions of bailout to begin with, of course, the initial bailout, and then it'll go from there. The Cyprus bailout is about the same magnitude. It's about 10 billion, 12, 15 billion, something like that. Not so different. And then we've had the Europeans. It is a leaderless group. You have a group of incompetent Eurogharks and Eurocrats. You've got Van Rompuy, you've got Olli Rehn, you've got Barroso. You've got a group of fundamentally incompetent individuals who have gone down the path of neoliberal economics, the neoliberal synthesis, the Washington consensus, you can call it. You can also call it, well, you can call it many things. But what they've done now is they tried, first of all, to have a bailout of the Spanish banking system direct. In other words, not going through the Spanish government, because they wanted to save the face of Rajoy, because he's such a wonderful reactionary. They wanted to try to save his face. But in effect, they had to bail out the Spanish banks, but that was obviously not enough. And now in the past 24 hours, again, we're speaking on the 29th, Friday, 29th of June, we've just had the latest, I think we've had 19 or 20 European summits during the time that Europe has been under attack by the U.S. and the British. This has been an attack with credit default swaps, with ratings agencies, Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor's, all mobilized to attack Europe. We've had idea dinners at Moness, Crespi, and Hart. We've had all of these developments. And the Europeans are still at the level. We had at the beginning of this week the idea of a stimulus plan of about 150 billion euros. Well, 150 billion, of course, it's better than nothing, but it's chicken feed. It's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop on the hot stone, as you say in German. It's going to fizzle and go away. You need to start with a terror tranche. You need to start with 1 trillion euros. And you don't want to do that on budget. You don't want to have to take that out of taxpayer income. That money has got to be generated by the European Central Bank using the inherent credit-creating power of a national, or in this case, a European bank. Yes. And they'll say, "Oh, the money is manufactured out of thin air." Yes, that's exactly it. But that money is your way to take empty factories, put them together with unemployed workers, restart production, and you will make a real absolute profit that will allow that loan to be paid off. So you start by creating credit. Yes, credit creation for national infrastructure, for housing programs, to create the 40 million plus jobs that would be needed to return Europe to economic normalcy. Instead, what do we have? We're now told the big news today is that Mrs. Merkel, pounded again by the British, among others, has now caved, and the European Financial Stability Fund, EFSF, I think it's still called. It's changing, but I think that's basically it. You get the idea what I mean. European Financial Stability Fund is now available not just to bail out countries, but to recapitalize zombie banks. So the big winners of this overnight meeting were the Euro zombies. The Euro zombies, my God, they are black holes. This is literally, it's not even pouring your money down a rat hole. It's firing your money into a black hole. In other words, an area of financial gravity collapse where once your money disappears beyond the event horizon, you are lost. That's it. It's gone. It's gone into another dimension. There is no way to bail out a zombie bank which has been loaded with derivatives. It cannot be done. And poor Mrs. Merkel has no alternative. She basically has, what she's preaching is draconian killer austerity. This has been tried in Greece. Greece has gone from about the total debt, national debt of Greece, the bonded debt of the Greek government has gone from 125% of the yearly gross domestic product at the beginning of this process to 170%, and it's on its way to 190% as a direct result of the austerity plan. Merkel, open your eyes. Austerity does not work. And again, she needs to go back and realize that Brüning was a failure, that Borchardt is wrong, and Holzfrerich is right, that there were alternatives, the Wojtycki plan and the Wilhelm Lautenbach plan that we represent here on this broadcast. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.
America's #1 source for independent talk radio for over a decade. We are the GCN Radio Network.
Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So what is the answer for Europe? We can put this in a number of ways, but the immediate thing to stop the crisis, remember June 1931. So this is now 81 years ago. Around this time of year, in June, a couple of weeks earlier, but essentially June 1931, we had Herbert Hoover, the most hidebound, had the reputation of being the president. He got this not because he was opposed to presidential action, but because he stubbornly refused to do anything effective to fight the world economic depression that broke out in the United States after the crash of 1929. But Herbert Hoover did, excuse me, Herbert Hoover had the merit in June of 1931 of coming up with the Hoover moratorium. What was it? He got a letter from Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who was the president of Germany, saying, we are in trouble. We're going to collapse here economically. And Hoover then said, well, I'm going to issue an invitation to everybody involved to neutralize, to freeze the most dangerous categories of international financial debt. And those were the reparations owed by Germany as a result of the Versailles Treaty to France and to Britain, to Italy to some extent. And then, at the same time, I'm going to freeze the war debts, the debts owed, the inter-allied debts owed by Britain, France, Italy, others, to the United States. So we're just going to stop paying all of that. And this is a tremendously good idea. The most obvious limitation is that Hoover only wanted to do this for 1 year. It should have been for the duration of the world depression, for the duration of the crisis, or 5 years, or whichever lasts longer. And a mechanism had to be specified. When could you say the world financial crisis had ended? So the problem in those days was that the French dragged their heels. They weren't willing to do what was necessary in the useful time. So some of the effect of it was nullified. Although eventually it went through. So that's Herbert Hoover. If you had a real American president today, you could easily say, I see Europe being destroyed by derivatives. And we here in the United States have had a terrible experience with derivatives. Derivatives were illegal from 1936 to 1982, totally banned under the Commodities Exchange Act. Then there was a period where they were in the gray area. Some people thought they were legal, would stand up in court. Others said, no, they'll never stand up in court. Towards the end of the Clinton years, in a lame duck session at the end of 2000, at the tail end of Clinton had 1 month left in office when this occurred. We have the I guess it's called the Commodity Modernization Act, that reaffirms the legality of derivatives and deregulates them. And from that 2000 monstrosity, passed by a reactionary Republican Congress and then approved by Clinton with advice from Rubin and Summers, there's a direct path. 7-8 years later, the world economy blows up precisely because of derivatives in the United States. Therefore, a useful thing that Obama could do, using presidential powers, foreign policy, make an appeal, say, the United States will urge and support an immediate total freeze on all payments of interest and principal on derivatives. Any international debt that involves a financial derivative, an option, a future, an index, a structured investment vehicle, a collateralized debt obligation, a credit default swap, a synthetic credit derivative, any combination of index, future, option, in any form, that money will be frozen. You will not have to pay that for 5 years and for the duration of the crisis, whichever lasts longer. Now, that would be leadership. That would be a tremendous thing also to get the United States out of depression. The idea that the powers of the presidency don't allow you to fight a depression is ridiculous. The president has sweeping powers and could use them, right? And I'm not even talking about the Defense Production Act. At this point, we're just talking about suasion. We're talking about inviting people to do what they would like to do anyway. At that point, some people would squawk. I guess we know the usual suspects. But squawk as they might, there would be a freeze on all international derivatives payments for the duration of the crisis. That would be a way to get out of this. Instead, it's interesting. At the beginning of the European crisis, the traditional view is if a bank makes bad investments, too bad for the bank. They were incompetent. They go bankrupt. They're left holding the bag. If a bank lends money to a sovereign state in Latin America or anywhere else, unless you have overwhelming military power, that state can default. They can declare a debt moratorium. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico have done it. 25, 30 countries in the recent decades have done it. Big ones, little ones, Russia, Costa Rica, so forth. They've all done it. If this occurs, it's too bad for the bank. They made a wrong bet. But now with the European Commission, Barroso and these people, with that neoliberal ideology that must be extirpated, they say, no, if the bank has lent money to the government, then it's the government's problem. The government must find ways to pay, meaning killer austerity. Well, of course, the killer austerity, as we've just seen, makes the deficit bigger in the out years, and it makes the debt burden correspondingly bigger. The credit agencies come in, they have their say, credit default swaps are used, and you wrap yourself then into this death spiral, which is what we're seeing in the case of Greece. Now, in Greece, at least, as we've been hearing in recent weeks, we do have on the scene a competent force which has at least the basics of what it's going to take to lead Greece out of this crisis. But in the other countries, we're still waiting. And the professorial critique that we hear in Germany, that it's all illegal, this is fine. I mean, this is satisfying to legal cranks, but it doesn't get you anywhere because your problem is not to provide a legal opinion, but to defeat a depression and to save a workforce and an export economy from the destruction which otherwise awaits. It's more of a military and political problem than it is a legal one. So I would recommend, if we had a real president in the United States, and I would call on any president and continue to call, independent of whoever is going to be in this post, declare a world freeze on derivative debt. Payments of interest and principal on derivative debt must be brought to an end. We've got to wipe out derivatives. We're now seeing that the derivatives burden is in excess, most likely, of the 1.5 quadrillion, beyond 2 quadrillion. It may be larger than we think. It is a multiple. It's approaching, in recent years, about 65 times the total GDP of the world, and the total GDP of the world is also inflated because it includes financial speculation and various kinds of financial hot air. But now we may be approaching 100 times the world gross domestic product. So this thing that came out of Brussels is yet another failure. So fight derivatives. Declare derivatives illegal, tax them, ban them, freeze them, and then seize control of the European Central Bank and start issuing those trillion-dollar tranches for infrastructure, and you'll get a recovery. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the last program of the first half of 2012. It's the 29th of June here in the afternoon, and it's about 100 degrees in Washington, D.C. Now let us look at the health care decision, the Constitution, the Roberts Court, the presidential campaign, the Romney attempt to seize power, I believe backed by the banking elite. We want to include Ron Paul, to be sure, the right-wing man and helper of Romney. But let's just look at what has occurred. The first thing I would say is, remember, my position, Medicare for all. Medicare for all. They call this single payer. Nobody knows what single payer means. This is a terrible slogan. This is a slogan designed to lose. I think the slogan was designed by enemies of the concept. But we have Medicare. Medicare works fine. Remove, simple bill, one line. Remove the 65 age limit. In other words, you've got to be 65 years old to get Medicare. Remove it. Make it available to any person. Any person means anybody, and you want to charge $100 or slightly more, $100 and some change per person per month. If you are unemployed, if you are destitute, it goes down and it can be completely remitted down to zero. So you can get it cut in half or in quarter. You can cut it down. The question of paying, though, in terms of money, has got to be put into perspective, right? The typical pathology, the fetishism and alienation of this society is that the money part is always what's up front, right? Typical, crackpot libertarian economics. Always talks about money, never talks about production. We would need to train about 250,000 doctors in the next couple of years. The U.S. rate of doctors per capita, we have 3.9 doctors per capita, per thousand, I guess, in the United States, and an average of 6 or 7 advanced industrial countries has 6.4. So we would need to increase the number of doctors, because otherwise you can have all the money you want. If there's no doctor, you're not going to get treated. You can have a great policy. You got to have a doctor. The other question is hospitals, right? The wonderful model here is the Hill-Burton Law of 1946, good, strong New Deal legislation. The Hill-Burton Law said, among other things, no racial discrimination in hospitals. Good thing. The Hill-Burton Law said the goal for the United States is to reach 4.5 beds per 1,000 population. And right now, we have 3.1 beds per 1,000 population, according to some recent statistics. The average of these other countries is almost 5 beds. So the other countries on this list of advanced industrial or post-industrial countries is they fulfill the Hill-Burton target of 1946, but the U.S. is at 3.1 beds per 1,000. The Hill-Burton standard was 4.5 beds per 1,000. So this means that you would have to build 50% of the existing beds and add that into the total in order to reach the 1946 target. Interesting statistic is that the U.S. longevity, right? In other words, your life expectancy is not that great compared to Japan, compared to Italy. It is 78.7 years at birth now. Other countries do much better. So there is a physical infrastructure in this thing which ought to be at the center of our considerations, but never is. It's never mentioned, right? The idea is, well, as long as you're moving money around, the doctors will be there. Well, what if they're not there? Now, in terms of what occurred, it was a surprise because it was widely expected that the reactionaries of the Rats Cabal, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia, would join with the reactionary tending Justice Kennedy to strike down the entire law, to strike it down in whole or in part. And instead what we have is the unexpected switch of Roberts, in which he broke his voting pattern on virtually every case so far and joined with the leftogarchs, I guess we can call them, the leftogarchs of the court, Ginsburg, Breyer, Kagan, Sotomayor, plus Roberts. That made the majority. I believe that's the first time that's ever happened, or at least on a major case. So a surprise, to be sure. What had happened? I think there's internal evidence in one of Scalia's ranting opinions, and we'll get to the fascist Scalia in just a minute here. There is evidence that originally there was a 5-4 vote to strike down all or most of the Obamacare. And you can see this because Scalia, in his screed, refers to Ginsburg as a dissent. Well, it's not a dissent. She's with the majority. So it looks like the fascist Scalia was writing his screed when he believed that Ginsburg was in the minority. But then something happened. Now, what could have happened? The obvious thing is this. one of the salient aspects of Obamacare is that it represents for insurance companies what the Federal Reserve and the TARP represented for zombie banks. In other words, a bailout. Starting in 2014, 2015, really reaching full tilt by 2016, everyone in the United States under this individual mandate will have to buy insurance, and the majority of those will be for-profit private insurance companies. So it tends to bail them out, doesn't it? It increases the cash flow to precisely these companies. So that's an obvious interest for them. My guess is that what happened to Roberts was this. Wall Street representatives, insurance company representatives came to Roberts and said, listen, sonny boy, you may believe this garbage ideology of original intent and textualism and all the idiocy that you have imbibed in your law schools. But then the Wall Street guys went on to say, we have financed that ideology, but we did it for our own purposes. We don't believe our own ideology, and what we want here is money. We don't want you to act out your ideological purity by striking down this law with these four other creatures that you have here, right? The rest of the rats cabal plus Kennedy. You are here to produce for us. We're Wall Street. We are dominant. We tell you what to do. You jump. And yes, indeed, he jumped. Roberts jumped from the majority to strike it down. Ideologues all, right? Lunatic ideologues, original intent theorists, textualists, reactionaries, proto-fascists, fascists in the case of Scalia. He jumped over to the left-oligarch side, and the left-oligarch side has more complicated ideas, but Wall Street is also, they're not insensitive to the needs of Wall Street, needless to say. So that's how you got the result. However, we got to put this in perspective now, because I do not share the apocalyptic despair of so many, especially the libertarians. Right? Let's be specific. People who are they're just trying to overcome their hangover from the betrayal of Ron Paul. They need to look deeper. The whole Ron Paul business is not a matter of individuals. His treachery is rooted in the libertarian Austrian doctrine itself. His betrayal, his stab in the back, his nepotism, is exactly what you'd expect from an Austro-libertarian. They're indissolubly linked. We'll be back in a minute.
Are you tired of searching for great talk radio?
Something more important.
Search no more. We are the GCN Radio Network.
Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Let's put this in class terms. The ideology of Austrianism, libertarianism, is, of course, financed by finance oligarchs. It is paid for by David Rockefeller. When David Rockefeller gives money to von Hayek, when David Rockefeller gives money to von Mises, as he did, he supported them both. When Peter Thiel of the Bilderberg Steering Committee gives money to Ron Paul or his super PAC to support his campaign, again, with the idea of helping Romney, but helping him through Ron Paul and appreciating the ideological poison that Paul is going to spread. This just shows that Austrianism, libertarianism, is a slave ideology. It's an ideology for dupes and tools of big finance capital, of the top levels in Wall Street. They finance it for a reason, but they don't believe it in the sense that they lose sight of what they're after, which is money and power. They're not after the ideological purity of the marketplace like various crackpots. Now, the problem in a crisis like this, in a depression, and we've seen this sadly in Europe between the two world wars, Italy, Germany, leading examples, France, Poujadisme, another example, and in the U.S., right, the growth of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s and 30s. The petty bourgeoisie goes berserk. They feel that they're going to precipitate into the proletariat or even the lumpen proletariat. In other words, they're going to lose everything. And the fear in the petty bourgeoisie, since they remain tied in terms of their thinking to the finance oligarchs, they have no alternative in terms of a model of society, they then become reactionaries with an activist edge. It's the Tea Party. The Tea Party is crazed, berserk, middle-class, petty bourgeois people who feel that they are threatened, they're under attack, and they respond with, yes, of course, racism. There's no use denying that. But their idea is that the social welfare spending of the government is somehow being stolen from them to give it to black people and to give it to Hispanics. This is their obsession, and this is where the racism is integrally involved. So what happened is this ideology, the anti-government, pro-market Austrianism, right-wing anarchism, obviously, this has an appeal to 10, 15, 20% at most. 20%, I think, is about the upper limit of this crazed petty bourgeoisie. Now, those are the Ron Paul voters. That's where that comes from. But it's limited because it has these obvious self-destructive features that you're campaigning to have yourself stripped of your own economic rights. I mean, you're basically saying you want to be flayed alive by government agencies, ironically. So in this case, we had Roberts, believing this garbage, right? The original intent and so forth. These things have been concocted by Wall Street and its minions over decades and decades. The Mount Pelerin Society, a leading case in point, right? The Mount Pelerin Society meeting in Vevey, Switzerland, above Vevey, Lake Léman, in 1947 with von Hayek and Milton Friedman and so forth, William Buckley, right-wing CIA, Otto von Habsburg's people at least were there, and so forth. That's where the ideology on the economic side, and then this kicks over into the neocon thinking, but also the Federalist Society and people like this, right? The Constitution in exile, the theory that the New Deal perverted the wonderful original intent of these wonderful free market Austrian founders. Of course, we know Benjamin Franklin, an Austrian, Alexander Hamilton, an Austrian, George Washington, an Austrian, Henry Clay from Vienna. They're all Austrians back there. They all believe in the free market. This is an absolute lunatic crackpot mythology. So Roberts was going to act out his mythology, and I would say that one influence on him might obviously be Scalia. We got to talk about Scalia. Scalia has now unmasked himself as a raving fascist. There is no other word. Scalia is a fascist. He had an outburst at the time the Supreme Court was giving the election to Gore over Bush in 2000. Scalia was out there with a screed saying, and by the way, you don't have a right to vote. There is no right to vote in the federal Constitution. Sorry, Scalia, Antonin, it's in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment in particular. The 15th Amendment gives the states, it denies them the ability to take away your inherent right to vote. So I noticed that the left libs, that Scalia's fascist raving is now so extreme that even the left libs have come up with E.J. Dionne saying it's time for him to resign. Scalia should resign. Well, he's not going to resign. So E.J. Dionne and other left libs, it's time to launch Impeach Scalia. Some of these people are old enough to remember Impeach Earl Warren. That was a bumper sticker. That was for racists who didn't like the Warren court. He came in as a reactionary. He flipped. He voted for he voted for racial integration. One of the reasons was that we were getting rid of this terrible opprobrium in the Cold War. How do you go up against the Soviets if you've got racist Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws in your southern states? And above all, how do you compete in the world if you're putting 10 or 15% of your workforce into a situation of inferior education? So the racists responded with impeach Earl Warren. But now, impeach Scalia for fascism. He is the guy who in 2000 said, you have no right to vote. He's the one who's always saying that money should talk, right? And that's what should determine these elections. And now he's attempting to strike down this entire thing, including the ban on pre-existing conditions, right? Scalia says, no, that's communism. Got to get rid of it. Got to treat it all as one unit. And it's interesting that Romney then came out and embraced that raving regurgitation of all the ideological poisons of the last 10 or 20 years, which is the minority opinion, right, written by these people, Kennedy, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, right? The rats cabal split on this one, and Kennedy leaped over to join the reactionary bloc. Those are reactionary ideologues. The most extreme of them is Scalia. It's Scalia who's dragging the whole thing towards fascism, where he already is at the most rapid rate. He's got to be impeached. Impeach Scalia. And anybody who's celebrating that dissent, you're in bed with a fascist. So think twice. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.
The GCN Radio Network, providing the world with hard-hitting talk radio. GCN. Great talk radio starts here.
Welcome to World Crisis Radio. Once again, Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So Roberts was probably flipped by pressure from Wall Street, the insurance companies. Scalia is a fascist. The other thing is the way Roberts did this is also venomous. He says that the existing Obamacare cannot be justified under the Commerce Clause, right? Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. It has to be treated as a tax. And, of course, as soon as you say tax, we get the whole nominalist, idiotic debate. Is it a tax? Is it a penalty? Who cares? This is ridiculous. If you are dying from lack of health care, you don't care whether it's a penalty, a tax, or whatever it is. And, I think that is the beginning of wisdom, is to see it from this point of view. But he's interested in gutting the Commerce Clause. In order to get a victory on this, the four left oligarchs were willing to go along with him on that. They could have done a separate four-person opinion saying, we believe it's okay under the Commerce Clause and under the taxation powers, but maybe that was, maybe Roberts said, if you do it that way, I won't give you what you want. They should have hung tough because he was going to do what Wall Street wanted, which was to save the individual mandate. It was widely expected that Roberts would join the reactionaries. That is why Fox and CNN gave you the wrong information at the beginning, that the whole thing had been struck down. But let's now talk about the individual mandate, right? Because this is to some degree the heart of the matter. I'm not for the individual mandate on political grounds, on policy grounds. But at the same time, let us have enough of this stupid fundamentalist garbage of saying if you don't like something, you got to have it, you got to declare it unconstitutional. I do not buy the enumerated powers. I'm a Hamiltonian. I believe in the inherent powers, the implied powers. I believe in the John Marshall method, which is that if the goal is coherent with the Constitution and the means are not specifically banned, you can go ahead and do it. That's John Marshall. That's one of the great nationalist founding fathers of this country, without which this country would have collapsed. If it had been left up to Jefferson and Madison, then the British Death Watch would have had a wonderful success waiting for it. The enumerated powers are not the whole story. There are enumerated powers, yes, but then there's also this other one called the elastic clause. All laws necessary and proper to carry out these powers and other powers vested in the government by the Constitution. And what other powers? The general welfare clause, which is there not once in the preamble, it's there, and it's then again twice as one of the main tasks of Congress. So I say the individual mandate is constitutional, but certainly not the way I would do this. I'm against the individual mandate. I am for Medicare for all. That means you're dealing with Medicare. The private insurance would presumably continue to exist. You want to supplement your Medicare with that, go ahead and do it. And I'm not forcing anybody into Medicare. I say Medicare for all if you want it. And believe me, they'll want it. They're going to want it. And a lot of people in these benighted southern states with the reactionary governors and the sky-high infant mortality, they're also going to want it. But let's look at the constitutional argument in more detail. First of all, we're told in the wonderful halcyon days of the founding fathers, with original intent oozing from every pore, nobody would have allowed an individual mandate. Well, we have this article from Professor Einer L. Haug, EINERELHAUGE, Harvard Law School, April 13th, 2012, in the New Republic. The first Congress, with George Washington in the White House, the first Congress had 20 framers of the Constitution. They passed an individual mandate to require that ship owners in the American merchant marine, in other words, commerce in freight-carrying ships, they had to buy medical insurance for their sailors. So we're told today, you can't force small business to provide medical insurance for their employees. Well, don't look now. 1790, with 20 framers of the Constitution, and I believe they're all voting in the affirmative, you've got to provide medical insurance for your sailors, signed into law by George Washington, the father of his country. And it goes on. 1792. At this point, we've got 17 framers, 17 participants in the Constitutional Convention. 13 of the 17 vote in favor of an individual mandate. All able-bodied males must procure firearms. It probably means you have to buy one, and you have to buy it from a private company, unless you can find a government arsenal, and I don't think they had them. Later on, we had, Water of Liette Arsenal and similar places. That's 1792, signed by George Washington. And also, if 13 of 17 framers voted for it, means 4 voted against it. But there's no indication that any of the 4 said, this is unconstitutional. They just said, I don't think this is expedient. I don't think this is the right policy. So the notion, I believe it's linked to Protestant fundamentalism. It's the literal inerrancy of Scripture that somehow has to be transferred to the Constitution. And therefore, if you want to make a really powerful case against something, you've got to argue it's unconstitutional. Well, it not always is it. And even the Republicans were saying that yesterday, right? A lot of Republicans were saying, just because it's constitutional doesn't mean it's a good idea. Right. That's exactly right. So let's have instead of always having this, this Jeffersonian crackpot reference to the enumerated powers, let's get in there and debate the merits of things as policy rather than, oh, no, you can't do that. Then, 1798, this is the crowning one of this series. 1798, Congress enacts an individual mandate. If you're a sailor on an American merchant ship, you must buy hospital insurance. You must buy. Signed into law by President John Adams. John Adams, the Hercules of independence. John Adams, whose Massachusetts Constitution, I hope we have time either this week or next week, That's the model for the U.S. federal Constitution. He was not at the Constitutional Convention. We hear all this gobbledygook about Madison and these people. John Adams is the man. He wrote the Massachusetts Constitution. It's still in force, and that is the basis of the federal Constitution. So here we see the reactionary myth that the Founding Fathers opposed the expansive use of federal powers is baseless. There was an individual mandate that went through in 1798. Now, here's the other thing. I was actually convinced of this during the Supreme Court arguments a couple of months ago. I was of the opinion when the Obama bill first came through that forcing you to buy something from a for-profit, private, deregulated company was unconstitutional, and I have seen that that is not so. One is this historical argument that I've just gone through. I was not aware of those cases. Those are powerful cases. That essentially wipes out the original intent people and the textualists, right? They can be dispensed with at this point. But here's the other thing. You have a federal law in force that says if you are having a medical emergency and you go or are brought to an emergency room, you must be treated irrespective of your ability to pay. I think that is the principal reason why an individual mandate ought to be allowed. Although I'm against it on policy grounds. I want Medicare for all. But if necessary, you could say that there's no constitutional objection to an individual mandate. Back in a minute.
America's #1 source for independent talk radio for over a decade. We are the GCN Radio Network.
Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So to sum up, don't kid yourself on the individual mandate. It's bad policy. That's fine. We need Medicare for all, for everybody. No age limit, $100 per person per month, and if you're destitute, for free. If you're unemployed, for a sharply reduced rate. Bad policy, but it's not unconstitutional. And you can see the first Congress, they start saying owners of merchant ships have got to buy medical insurance. Later on, every able-bodied man has got to buy a gun. And then the capper in 1798, every sailor has got to buy hospital insurance. This seems to liquidate that argument. And then, in terms of the more practical present-day situation, there is a federal law saying if you're having an emergency, if you've been hit by a car or you're having a heart attack, you can be taken to an emergency room. You must be treated for free, because there had been horrendous cases of people who died previously before this federal law was passed. They'd take you there and they say, oh, having a heart attack, are you? Let's check your insurance. That takes 3 hours, and then you're dead. So that had to be done. It would have been more elegant, obviously, to join these things together, saying you will get treatment, and at the same time, everybody has got to buy some kind of a catastrophic policy or some form of insurance to deal with the cost that will otherwise be generated. Now, this is not my idea of how to do it. I don't like this. I want Medicare for all. A lot of the reactionaries I have to deal with want nothing. They want go and die, leave you nothing but your eyes to cry with. I'm for Medicare for all. I get emails from reactionaries who say strike it down and you're on your own. No, that's not acceptable. Not good enough for the American people. Because remember, you have a right to health care. You have an inalienable right to health care. It's not a commodity. It's not something that you can either get or not get depending on whether you got money. It's not a privilege that you can get or not get depending on whether you're born into a favored family, like little Rand Paul was born into the gold-plated world of Ron Paul with a gold spoon in his mouth. No. And a lot of other people who don't understand what grinding want actually means, it's a right. And it's one of the rights of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Economic Bill of Rights of January 1944, that should have been put into the Constitution. The GIs who went up the beach in Normandy and Tarawa were fighting for the Economic Bill of Rights, and they never got it because Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, Ron Paul's ego ideal, came in right after the war with the help of Truman and aborted the process, right? And that's why we have union-busting states under the Taft-Hartley Act, a mass, an undigestible mass of backward and reactionary opinion. So since there is this requirement that you'll be given treatment, you are part of the market. You're already in the market. You're born into the market, and you're a heartbeat away or a wrong turn on the road away from enjoying free medical care. And again, this is not my way. However, given the society that we have, right, with the preponderant power of Wall Street, this is about how things are going to get done. Let's be realistic. And the other thing is, if you don't like it, what's the opposition? Well, the opposition is Ron Paul, who wants to leave you to die, and then adbusters who want to go camp in the park and they don't care what happens to you either way. What do you think is going to happen? You want to change things. You build an opposition according to my method and my approach and my program. And again, Syriza shows that it's possible. When you have leadership, program, organization, and a strategy, you can work wonders, but not reactionary Ron Paul and his little son Rand, and not adbusters David Graeber and the crackpot anarchists who want to camp in the park and have a hippie commune. Now, I think that does it for the individual mandate. But now let's look at the positive side, because there is a positive side. Right now we have this. We have a number of programs that you can turn to. There is Medicaid. If you're poor and in the States, you can get Medicaid through your state, right? Badger Care, all these different things. But for this, you have to be basically destitute. You can't really have any property for that. So that's Medicaid. You got to be really poor. There is Medicare, which is a more generous program, and it is an economic right. There's no means test. You get it when you become 65. And again, my approach is remove the 65, make it available from birth to death. Medicare for all, $100 a month. If you're a child to an adolescent, if you have poor parents, you can get SCHIP, State Child Health Insurance Policy. If you've just been fired from a job, you can get COBRA, which is the continuation of your employer-related insurance, but you got to pay the premium. The premium is going to be a lot. COBRA is expensive. And then if you're a veteran, you can get the Veterans Administration. But now we're dealing with 50 million people who have no job, no unemployment benefits, no health insurance practically, and they live on food stamps. What happens if you're in the middle class, you lose your job, and you're too young for Medicare, you're not poor enough for Medicaid, you're too old for SCHIP, you run out of COBRA or you can't afford it, and you're not a veteran? What happens to you? Are you supposed to die? Well, no. And now in 18 months, there's going to be at least some mechanism which promises that you will be able to get some coverage, because the thing that I think is interesting and positive about this law is that the pre-existing condition will cease to exist. There will be no such thing as a pre-existing condition. And this is the nightmare of the middle class, that you lose your job, the corporate raider Mitt Romney comes to town, destroys your job, you're sitting there, you don't qualify for any of these 5 programs, you're stuck in the middle, precisely the middle, and what do? Do you go bankrupt or do you die? Or do you do both? Go bankrupt and die. The benefit of of Obamacare is that now you have some hold on a government entitlement that will give you some kind of treatment, albeit through a private insurance company. Now remember, the private insurance companies ruled the roost. Let's not forget what they were. They were deregulated. They were for profit. You could not sue them. There was no patient bill of rights. They could say, once we reach $5 million with you, or $2 million, or $500,000, whatever it was, you have a lifetime limit, and once we've reached the lifetime limit, you don't get a penny more. You can go and die if you can't pay. They would also wait until you got sick and then kick you off the insurance. They would fight you at every turn. The HMO was designed to fight you with gatekeepers and denial of care. The pre-existing condition looms very, very large. Now, at the same time, we're not fools. There is IMAC and MedPAC. These are death panels. Yes, they are. They're for rationing. But don't kid yourself, you weren't under rationing before. Republicans love rationing through the market because they say, it's subjective. It's your fault. You don't have any money. You go and die. Well, with the current version, the left oligarch version that we're going to get, you're going to have death panels. But maybe organize a demonstration outside the death panel. Like get somebody like Butcher Berwick and put him on the hot seat, and maybe you'll get somewhere. So obviously we want a campaign to abolish the death panels. The only way you can save money in a system like this is by finding cures. Not by killing people, by finding cures. You're spending a lot of money on cancer, cure it. Diabetes, cure it. Alzheimer's, cure it. Find a cure. That's how you do it. But that means you got to invest. You got to put your money into the biomedical research, along with training the 250,000 doctors and building probably 1,000 modern hospitals, as we talked about before. The other thing, of course, is we've got $500 billion that have been carved out of Medicare. That money, of course, has to be appropriated year by year through the normal appropriations process. So we want to fight this overall guideline that Medicare has to be cut. Medicare will not be cut. So get out there and fight. And if you spent your last year supporting Ron Paul, you got nobody to thank but yourself for your current impotence. And if you spent the last year supporting ad busters, Peter Graber, and the We Want to Camp in the Park types, right, the high campers, unhappy campers, then that's no opposition. So therefore, we'll talk about it more. The National Emergency Anti-Austerity Conference has got to be held. National Emergency Anti-Austerity Conference. And by the way, I believe that now that the insurance companies have locked up their money, they're going to proceed to put Romney in the White House. This is not going to help Obama. Romney goes to the White House, and he'll try and probably fail, and he won't try that hard to overturn this because the individual mandate they want. But again, in order to get the individual mandate, they've given some things that we want. Class struggle goes on. And we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. This week we've got to cover the developments in Syria, the unfolding of the world and European financial crisis. We've got to talk about the health care decision at the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll try to find time to say a few things about Marx. I see people are interested in Marx and Marxism. We should say a few things about the U.S. Constitution to dispel some obscurantist propaganda, and we may even get a chance to look back to the War of 1812, 200 years ago. Boy, if you want to see evidence that Thomas Jefferson was one of the worst presidents, right? Thomas Jefferson almost lost this country. The country was almost destroyed under Jefferson and Madison and their crackpot views. That almost ended everything back in the War of 1812. So we've got to talk about all of that. Remember that you want to keep up with everything at tarpley.net. There are always new postings at tarpley.net. And there you find my books. People have been sending me emails. They support my work. Please, if you do, make it concrete. Buy my books, read them, discuss them, popularize them, introduce them on internet sites, on talk radio, or anywhere else. But those books, and if you want to talk to me about issues, don't try to reconquer elements of the Ottoman Empire, such as Syria, but rather concentrate on development and solving your problems at home. Will Erdogan do that? The other thing about Erdogan is he thinks he's cutting the figure of the new Ottoman hegemon of the Middle East. Look at who he's working for. He's the running dog of the Saudi royal family. He's the running dog of Qatar. He's the running dog of those United Arab Emirates, the most reactionary, the most feudal, the most oppressive, the most benighted people in that part of the world are essentially paying the bill for Erdogan. He's working for them. And if we go back to World War I, Erdogan, in the dream of neo-Ottomanism, is putting Turkey under the control of these upstarts who rebelled, right? Who was the Saudi royal family? They were just a bunch of nomads picked up by the British and put on the throne. And the same thing goes for these emirates, right? Kuwait, created by the British, right? Carved out of the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. So this is not a path of glory for Turkey, and we seem to have some awareness of this in the Turkish political process. We have the Republican Party. There's a guy called Kılıçdaroğlu. They are saying we need to stop the needless provocations of Syria. There is going to be a backlash within the country because many Turks are just too intelligent to go down this road. But I think Erdogan and Davutoglu have kind of lost it when it comes to reality. And of course, on the one side, they make Turkey into a terror base, right? Rick, please read the relevant book because I unfortunately will not have time to reproduce those arguments individually for people in emails. If you want to talk about 9/11, well, read 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA in the 5th edition, and you'll know exactly what I think about it. That is more authoritative than any conference presentations, especially conference presentations under the somewhat difficult conditions of this last conference in Vancouver, British Columbia. But let's look at Syria first of all. On the surface, we are edging towards a regional war in the Middle East. This is not irrevocable. Some of this is war. Some of this is propaganda. But on the other hand, in the past week, we've had Turkey, first of all, sending a reconnaissance-configured F-4 Phantom jet into the airspace of Syria. They did this as a provocation. They were testing. The plane flew in and out of Syrian airspace, back in, back out, back in, back out, and eventually, conflicting reports, anti-aircraft artillery or a surface-to-air missile took care of this Phantom. One of the aspects of this that we should note is it shows Syria is not a cakewalk. Syria is not defenseless. Syria has air defenses. They are capable. They are alerted. They were not taken by surprise. They saw it coming. So there's the idea that if somebody wants to go blundering into Syria with aggression on the Libyan model, they will pay a heavy price. Good that they know it in advance, because this is by and large, the only thing that stops Anglo-Americans from going on their rampages of aggression. So right now, we've had a meeting of NATO about this. NATO, what are we talking? Chapter 5, I guess. The collective defense of the North Atlantic Treaty. Well, let me say, the willingness of the American people to fight a war in the defense of this border of Syria and Turkey and Syria is zero. And any president that does this will be joining LBJ in the historical doghouse of presidents that have destroyed themselves with lunatic foreign adventures. Now, the question with Turkey is obviously that of the leadership. Erdogan, how far is he prepared to go? Erdogan just had an election. He fell short of the 60%, I guess, he needed to have a unilateral control of the Constitution. He doesn't have a constitutional plebiscitary majority. He's only got 50.1% or something like that. So He may be resentful of that. He may feel that he needs to escalate foreign tensions in order to consolidate some power. But the question is, in crude terms, how crazy is Erdogan? How crazy is he? Has this dream of the Neo-Ottoman Empire that he thinks he's going to be the protagonist of, has this gone to his head so that he has lost all moorings in reality? Because that is what it will be, but that's the dream, but that will not be the reality. The reality is Ataturk was right. Turkey cannot survive as an imperial power. On the other hand, Turkey can be tremendously successful following the Ataturk model within the borders of Turkey. So Perry was right. It was an amazing moment. But Rick Perry was right to say Turkey is a base for al-Qaeda. It is. Go to Iskandarun. You'll find al-Qaeda in the next room in the hotel. Tourism to Turkey, not a good bet at this time. So they've got the al-Qaeda moving in. You've done that. Well, then you've got safe havens on the Turkish side of the border. In theory, under international law, Syria would be justified in exercising hot pursuit of terrorists as they retreat back into Turkey after attacking on the Syrian side. Hot pursuit is an established category of international law. So you could violate the Turkish border if you wanted to and say, this is hot pursuit because they sent a death squad over here. They blew up some tanks. Now they're retreating. We're going to chase them back in. That's called hot pursuit. This is an interesting doctrine. But generally speaking, the dangerous thing is that in Erdogan's speech, he says, any Syrian forces approaching the Turkish border will be shot at. Wait a minute, approaching? So I'm the Syrian army. I can drive my tank up to a mile from the border, up to half a mile. What's approaching? What does this mean? Are we getting into the logic of a buffer zone and a humanitarian corridor, a juridical vacuum where the Syrian government won't exist, but the death squads would have a base? Back in a minute.
Are you tired of searching for great talk radio?
Something more important.
Search no more. We are the GCN Radio Network.